June 1941. Across Europe, the storm of war had raged for 2 years, yet on the Eastern Front, a deceptive calm lingered. Soldiers in barracks polished boots and tightened straps, their eyes heavy with routine drills and rehearsed discipline. The forests and fields of Eastern Europe seemed peaceful, almost indifferent, hiding the gathering tempest. High command in Berlin studied maps, marked troop movements, and whispered of strategies that would soon shake the world. For the ordinary soldier, life was measured in marches, inspections, and rumors. Few knew the scale of the operation that awaited them. The name, Operation Barbarossa, was still spoken in hushed tones, a shadowy promise of glory and danger. Officers barked orders, supply trains rumbled eastward, and yet the men could not imagine the fires that would soon engulf the horizon. In the Soviet Union, intelligence reports flickered across desks, unusual troop movements, increased reconnaissance flights, whispers of an impending invasion. Stalin received warnings, but doubts and disbelief slowed action. Along the border, Soviet sentries patrolled quietly, unaware that the war they had long prepared for would erupt within hours. In the towns and villages, civilians went about their lives, tending fields, caring for children, and listening to the radio for news from the front. They did not know that in the next dawn, the ground beneath them would tremble, the skies would roar with aircraft, and the horizon would burn. The calm before June 22 was fragile, a fleeting moment of normalcy before the largest invasion in human history would ignite the Eastern Front, forever changing the course of World War II. June 22, 1941. At dawn, the silence of the Eastern Front shattered. The German war machine, honed by years of conquest in Western Europe, unleashed a force the world had never seen. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's audacious plan to crush the Soviet Union in a single, overwhelming strike, was now in motion. Over 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and nearly 3,000 aircraft surged across a front stretching over 1,800 miles, their engines, tracks, and propellers creating a roar that seemed to shake the very earth. For the soldiers advancing into the east, the initial hours felt surreal. Villages appeared on the horizon like fragile toys in a landscape suddenly alive with fire. Luftwaffe bombers tore through the skies, raining destruction on airfields, supply depots, and communication hubs. Tanks rolled forward, their iron treads crushing everything beneath, flattening forests and fences alike. For those in the path, escape was nearly impossible, resistance was crushed with shocking speed. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, lived up to its name. On the Soviet side, confusion and disbelief reigned. Border outposts were overwhelmed within hours. Many commanders initially assumed the attacks were isolated skirmishes or provocations, underestimating the scale and ferocity of the assault. Red Army units, still reorganizing after the purges of the late 1930s, scrambled to respond. Communication lines were severed, radios destroyed, and entire divisions cut off before they could properly react. The sheer speed of the German advance created a sense of chaos that was almost paralyzing. For civilians caught in the maelstrom, the invasion was a waking nightmare. Towns were bombed indiscriminately, trains derailed, and roads choked with fleeing refugees. Fear spread like wildfire, and whispers of atrocities began almost immediately. Families abandoned homes, carrying what little they could, as the mechanized tide of war rolled toward them. By the end of the first day, hundreds of kilometers of Soviet territory had already fallen. German forces captured key towns and strategic points, advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. The coordination between panzer divisions and air support allowed the Wehrmacht to exploit every weakness, turning isolated resistance into routes. Supply lines strained under the rapid pace, yet the momentum remained unbroken. The Blitzkrieg in the east was not just a military operation, it was a psychological shock. Soldiers on both sides faced a new kind of warfare, one where speed, coordination, and terror dictated survival. The invasion had begun, and the Eastern Front would soon become the deadliest theater of World War II. The scale of destruction, the swiftness of the advance, and the human cost would leave a mark on history that echoed far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. The sun rose that morning, illuminating a continent forever changed. By evening, the map of Eastern Europe was being rewritten in fire, steel, and blood. The largest invasion in human history had begun, and there would be no turning back. The first hours of Operation Barbarossa left the Soviet Union reeling. The scale and speed of the German assault were unprecedented, shattering the fragile sense of preparedness along the border. Airfields that had housed hundreds of Soviet planes were now blackened ruins. Entire regiments were cut down before they could organize, and communication lines were severed. Radios crackled with panic, officers shouted contradictory orders, and the Red Army found itself scrambling to respond to a war it had barely anticipated. In many sectors, the initial shock turned into outright chaos. Soldiers who had trained for months, expecting to defend a fortified line, were suddenly facing a storm of mechanized assault and air bombardment. The panzer divisions, spearheaded by tiger-like precision and coordinated air support, penetrated deep into Soviet territory within hours. Roads, railways, and bridges that were meant to delay the enemy became corridors of advance, funneling retreating troops into bottlenecks where artillery and dive bombers decimated them. Commanders on the front struggled to maintain control. Stalin's initial disbelief delayed critical decisions. Many local leaders hesitated to act without direct orders from Moscow. By the afternoon of June 22, reports poured in of entire units encircled, communications cut, and towns falling without resistance. Panic spread among soldiers, many of whom had no experience in modern mobile warfare. The concept of a fast, armored blitzkrieg was alien, and the traditional Soviet doctrine of rigid defense and counterattack seemed inadequate in the face of the German advance. Civilians, too, were caught in the tide of retreat. Refugees flooded roads, choking the movement of what remained of the Red Army. Families abandoned homes, clutching whatever they could carry, while Luftwaffe bombers strafed fleeing columns. Fires consumed towns, smoke obscured the horizon, and screams mingled with the roar of engines and artillery. Fear was everywhere, and the sense of a coordinated defense crumbled under the psychological weight of the onslaught. By the end of the first day, German forces had advanced tens of kilometers, capturing key towns and strategic positions. Soviet units had lost cohesion, with some surrendering en masse, others scattering into the forests, and still others attempting counterattacks with minimal coordination. The Soviet High Command faced a mounting nightmare. Their front line was disintegrating, their reserves disorganized, and the speed of the German advance made regrouping almost impossible. Chaos persisted as retreating units collided with each other, supplies ran low, and orders failed to reach isolated outposts. Soldiers wrote in diaries and letters of confusion, fear, and disbelief, "We were trained to hold, but there was nothing left to hold," one officer noted. Another wrote, "The enemy is everywhere, faster than we can move, our tanks cannot keep up, our guns are silent, and the sky burns with planes." Yet, amid the retreat, pockets of resistance emerged. Small units, often cut off from command, fought desperately to delay the German advance, buying precious time for civilians to escape and for reserves to mobilize. These acts of courage would become the foundation of the Soviet defense, but in the opening hours, the picture was overwhelmingly one of chaos, shock, and retreat. The invasion had exposed the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities. The Wehrmacht's initial onslaught had achieved its goal. Confusion and disorder spread across the front. Entire divisions were shattered, supply lines destroyed, and the morale of soldiers tested beyond comprehension. June 22, 1941, was not just the beginning of the German invasion, it was the day the Eastern Front ignited, a day of chaos that would set the tone for months of brutal, desperate fighting. The Soviet retreat was a bitter reality, a painful testament to the speed and ferocity of blitzkrieg. Yet beneath the despair, the seeds of resilience were sown, for the Red Army would soon adapt, regroup, and transform chaos into defiance, setting the stage for one of history's most brutal and transformative conflicts. After the initial shock of June 22, 1941, the German war machine pressed relentlessly eastward. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's audacious plan to crush the Soviet Union in a single summer, relied on speed, coordination, an overwhelming force. Panzer divisions carved wide swaths through Soviet territory, infantry followed in their wake, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. By early July, the first major objective lay ahead, Smolensk, a city whose capture would open the route to Moscow and threaten the heart of the Soviet Union. The march to Smolensk was a combination of brilliance and brutality. German tanks thundered across the flat plains, but their advance was slowed by destroyed bridges, mined roads, and scorched earth tactics employed by retreating Soviet forces. Civilians fled in panic, clogging highways, while the Red Army sought to mount any resistance possible. Yet, despite pockets of fierce defense, the Wehrmacht pressed on. The panzer spearheads executed encirclements, trapping Soviet units in cauldrons that became death traps. Supplies were stretched thin, but the Germans relied on captured equipment and rapid movement to maintain momentum. Smolensk fell in mid-July after intense fighting. Streets ran red with blood, and thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. But even as the city was occupied, the Germans faced an unsettling reality: the Soviets were not crushed. Retreating forces regrouped beyond the city, digging defensive lines, laying mines, and preparing for the next stage of the advance. The initial shock that had paralyzed Soviet defenses began to fade, replaced by a grim determination to defend the motherland. From Smolensk, the path to Moscow seemed open. Hitler, confident in the Wehrmacht's superiority, ordered a direct push toward the Soviet capital. But the distance was vast, and the Russian summer was not kind to logistics. Roads turned to mud after rains, fuel and ammunition could not always reach the front, and long supply lines became vulnerable to Soviet raids. Soldiers marched for miles under scorching sun, their boots soaked in sweat and dust. Tanks and trucks broke down, horses faltered under the weight of loads, and commanders struggled to maintain discipline amid exhaustion. Resistance intensified as German forces approached the outskirts of Moscow. Soviet soldiers, reinforced by mobilized militias and freshly trained conscripts, slowed the advance. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and defensive positions grew more frequent, turning the flat expanses into deadly gauntlets. Luftwaffe air superiority, once absolute, began to face organized Soviet counterattacks. Guerrilla-style ambushes by small Soviet units disrupted convoys, burned fuel depots, and sapped morale. By late August and September, the Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of kilometers, but the cost was mounting. Tanks burned out, infantry suffered from fatigue, and winter was still months away but already whispered threats through cold nights. Hitler, impatient and demanding, pressed for Moscow, ignoring logistical warnings and the mounting exhaustion of his troops. Commanders like Guderian and Hoth warned of overextension, yet the Führer's vision of a swift victory left little room for caution. Despite setbacks, the German advance had achieved remarkable feats. Cities fell, entire armies were encircled, and Soviet defenses were severely strained. But the further the Wehrmacht marched, the more stretched their lines became. The Red Army, though battered, absorbed the blows, adapted tactics, and prepared the capital for a siege. Each kilometer brought the Germans closer to Moscow, yet also closer to a confrontation that would test the limits of men, machines, and morale. The march to Smolensk and Moscow was a study in speed, coordination, and hubris. It demonstrated the Wehrmacht's ability to move vast forces rapidly, but it also revealed the resilience of the Soviet Union. For every city captured, the Germans found another defensive line awaiting them. For every encirclement, the Red Army regrouped and fought anew. The road to Moscow would not be a triumphant march but a grueling campaign where exhaustion, winter, and resistance would collide in one of the most pivotal struggles of World War II. By the time the first German units reached the approaches to Moscow, it was clear that Operation Barbarossa had succeeded in creating chaos, but not in destroying the Soviet state. The stage was set for a battle that would decide the fate of Europe, a clash of endurance, strategy, and the unyielding human spirit. By late October 1941, the German advance toward Moscow had slowed, but the Wehrmacht pressed on, driven by Hitler's relentless demands. The summer's victories now felt distant, roads had turned to rivers of mud during autumn rains, vehicles sank, and soldiers trudged through exhaustion and dwindling supplies. Each kilometer eastward brought new challenges, but none so deadly as the approaching Russian winter. When November arrived, the cold struck with merciless force. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing, coating the ground in ice and snow. Engines failed in the frigid air, fuel lines froze, and weapons jammed. Men who had fought bravely under the sun now shivered in frost-bitten uniforms, their feet and hands numb, their morale cracking under the weight of hunger, fatigue, and the relentless cold. Medical supplies were scarce, and minor injuries became life-threatening. Soldiers huddled in trenches and abandoned buildings, praying for warmth that never came. The Soviet defenders, meanwhile, had adapted to their homeland's brutal climate. They launched counterattacks from prepared positions, using snow-covered terrain to their advantage. Mines, hidden trenches, and ambushes inflicted heavy losses. The Red Army's T-34 tanks, better suited to frozen terrain, struck where the heavier German armor bogged down. Air support, so dominant in summer, was limited by icy conditions and poor visibility. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, found itself slowed to a crawl, vulnerable to attacks and increasingly isolated. As winter tightened its grip, German supply lines collapsed. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements were trapped behind miles of ice and snow. Soldiers scavenged what little they could find, eating frozen rations or, in desperation, discarded supplies. Desertion and illness rose. High command orders made little sense on the frozen front, and discipline frayed. Even veteran commanders recognized the futility of pushing deeper into Soviet territory. By December, the offensive had ground to a halt. German units were encircled, frozen in place, and under constant attack. Moscow remained out of reach. What had been a lightning campaign, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had been brought low not by superior firepower, but by weather, logistics, and an enemy that refused to yield. The collapse of the offensive marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. Winter, long underestimated, had struck back with devastating precision. The German dream of a swift conquest ended in frozen misery, revealing the limits of arrogance, strategy, and human endurance. From that moment, the Red Army began to recover, regroup, and prepare for counter-offensives that would change the course of the war. The once mighty Wehrmacht learned a bitter lesson. In the east, the elements were as deadly as the enemy. The snow and ice of Russia were not just obstacles, they were unyielding forces that claimed men, machines, and momentum alike. Operation Barbarossa had stalled, and with it, Hitler's vision of a conquered Soviet Union froze in the bitter cold. The Eastern Front had ignited in June with fire and fury, but by December, the winter had shown its power. The offensive had collapsed, leaving frozen battlefields, exhausted soldiers, and the realization that the war in the East would be long, brutal, and far from over. Winter had struck back, and the tide of war had begun to turn.